Week 3 of the college football season is upon us, and we don't have the greatest slate this week, but there are a handful of games that have some potential. We're trying to rebound after a 2 and 3 week last week. I had a couple games that kind of bounced the wrong way, but again, we're trying to bounce back from that this week and try and go 5-0 this week. Why not? With that being said, let's go ahead and hop into the first game of this weekend slate. The first game we'll jump into is going to be BYU at Oregon. If we take a look at the stats, we'll see that both offenses have played pretty decent this year. Oregon went up against Georgia week 1. I mean, playing against that defense is no easy task. But in week 2, they were able to rebound against Eastern Washington, put up 70 points, so they're averaging about 35 points a game. BYU, on the other hand, is averaging 38 points a game. They scored 50 against USF week 1, and then last week they were able to manage 26 points against number 9 Baylor and get a win in double overtime. Defensively, BYU has the edge in terms of points allowed per game. Again, Oregon's is a bit skewed because of the beating they took against Georgia. But BYU's look pretty consistent, giving up about 20 to 21 points a game, which is why their points allowed is at 20 and a half. Offensively, both teams move the ball pretty well. BYU has a slight edge in passing yards, where Oregon has a slight edge in rushing yards. And then defensively, BYU has the edge in terms of yards allowed, which reflects in the points allowed per game. BYU is only averaging about 150 passing yards a game given up and 130 rushing yards a game given up, where Oregon's given up about 260 yards per game through the air and 116 on the ground. So I think this will be an interesting game. I think the preseason top 25 rankings weren't quite accurate for Oregon, putting them almost basically in the top 10. BYU was a fringe top 25 team to start the year, but they came out, beat USF pretty good, and then they were able to get a win last week against a legit Baylor team that was ranked number 9, who is the defending Big 12 champion. So it'll be an interesting game. It's slotted at the 3:30 slate. It's a national TV game on Fox, so everyone will be able to watch it. Personally, I think BYU is the right play here, especially if BYU has receivers Gunner, Romney, and Puka Nakua back. Those are their top two guys. Um, each of which have been out. They were out last week, and they were still able to get a win against number 9 Baylor. I just think BYU defensively is going to be a little bit more consistent than Oregon. We've seen Georgia kind of exploit certain parts of the Oregon defense, and I think BYU will have success throwing the ball against Oregon, especially with those receivers back. Oregon should be able to run the ball pretty well against BYU, which makes this game interesting because if Oregon can dominate the line of scrimmage, dominate time of possession, they should have a pretty decent shot at winning it. But I just think BYU has looked pretty legit this season. They're getting plus 3.5 after the two performances we've seen from Oregon are getting just steamrolled by number 3 Georgia and playing a bad Eastern Washington team and just kind of enforcing their will on them. I don't think Oregon's had to play in a close game yet. BYU, they last week went to double overtime. They've got the grittiness to go out and win a close game in the crunch time when they need to. And I think this one's going to be a close one. I'm not going to take BYU money line. I'm going to take them plus the points. As you can see, it's currently at plus 3.5, so that's what I'm going to be going with. But this should be an interesting game, and we'll see how it goes on Saturday. The second game I have on my betting slate for this Saturday is going to be Michigan State at Washington. Kind of the same logic as the last game. I think you get number 11 Michigan State. They did prove themselves last year to be a pretty solid football team. They have some deficiencies in their defensive secondary, but I think they're a Big Ten team. They play tough physical football. At Washington, I'm not convinced they're going to be a tough physical team. I think they're more of a Pac-12 kind of run and gun, let's throw the ball around the field type team. Um, but I could be wrong. We'll see. Their last two games, Michigan State beat Akron 52-0 and Western Michigan 35-13. Washington beat looks like Portland State 52-6 and Kent State 45-20. So both teams are 2-0. Both teams have had relatively weak schedules up to this point. They haven't really had a tough game yet. Looking at the stats, offensively, both teams are pretty similar. Defensively, State has a slight edge over Washington. Um, Not by much though. I mean, 6.5 to 13. It's only been 2 games, so it's hard to give a true judgment of the numbers for both teams. State's a pretty balanced team. Peyton Thorne, not the greatest quarterback in the world, but he's getting the job done for him with 235 passing yards a game on average. And like I said, they're going to be tough physical. They're going to run the ball, 200 and almost 30 yards per game thus far into the season. Washington, on the other hand, like I said, they like to throw the ball around, about 385 yards passing per game and 186 rushing per game. I think the rushing yards will not be anywhere close to 186 against this Michigan State defense. I think their front seven is going to dominate Washington, but it'll be up to Michigan State's secondary to kind of lock up Washington in the pass game if State wants to have a chance at winning this. Defensively, State's allowed 198 passing yards per game on average and 81.5 rushing yards per game on average. Like I said, I don't think Washington's going to run the ball. I expect that passing yards to be inflated. I mean, Ohio State exploited it last year, but I'd like to think after that performance last year by their secondary in the Ohio State game, they kind of took the initiative to kind of shore that area of their defense up this offseason. And then Washington's defense, pretty balanced. They don't allow much passing yards, and they don't allow a ton of rushing yards. 114 on average is pretty decent for a college football team. 121 and a half passing yards allowed per game is really good for a college football team. So I think it'll end up being State running the ball, Washington trying to throw the ball in the air. Um, it could just be a time of possession game. If Washington gets up, State struggles to kind of establish a lead in this game. They feel like they have to throw the ball to get themselves back into it. Washington's probably going to have some success. But if Washington makes some mistakes early, then Michigan State might be able to get a lead, run the ball, chew the clock, just kind of enforce their will up front, and Washington might be in trouble. But personally, I'm gonna go with Michigan State +3. I think Michigan State's legit. I don't know if 11's a fair assessment. I think they might be more of the high teens without Kenneth Walker this season. He, again, was a huge difference maker last year. Washington, I'm not sure what to think. They were very disappointing last year, but this year's an entirely new team, so we'll have to see what they have in store for this year. But again, yeah, it'll be an interesting one. I'm going to go State +3. The third game I have on my slate for this week is going to be Pitt at Western Michigan. I actually have 2 picks for this game. Currently, the spread is at either 10 or 11 at the time of recording this. My first pick's going to be Pitt minus spread. They've played 2 legit teams in West Virginia and Tennessee. Tennessee, they took to overtime last week and lost. West Virginia, they were able to come from behind and win 38-31. Western Michigan has played Michigan State, where they lost 35-13, and Ball State, where they lost 37-30. Taking a look at the numbers, Pitt is scoring more points per game than Western. They both have given up the same amount of points per game. Pitt's offense primarily coming through the air at 291 passing yards per game and 108.5 rushing yards per game. Western's a little bit more balanced at 211 passing yards per game and 174 rushing yards per game. And then defensively, Pitt is giving most of their yards up through the air with about 270 yards allowed through the air per game and 140 on the ground per game, whereas Western is kind of in the same boat, giving up a little bit more rushing yards, but similar passing yards at 262 passing yards per game. I think these 2 teams played last year. Western Michigan was able to upset Pitt even with Kenny Pickett at quarterback. I think Pitt, while they're not as good as they were last year, I don't think Western is as good as they were last year either. With a true freshman quarterback for Western, I think Pitt comes into Kalamazoo and they enforce their will on Western. I like Pitt here as kind of a revenge game from last year, kind of avenging their loss and they're going to come in angry after that overtime loss against Tennessee last week. And then my second pick, as we kind of took a look at the stats and see both teams' offenses are able to move the ball, and both teams' defenses have been struggling against their opponents this season. I'm going to take the over. Currently, I see it at 47.5, so that's what I'm going to take it at. Over 47.5 and -11 are going to be my two picks for this game. This one, it's on ESPNU, so people should be able to watch it. I don't think it'll be as interesting as the other two games I talked about already. I think Pitt is by far the better team, but Western being at home and having that confidence boost from beating them last year, you never know. They could come out and upset them again, or maybe cover. I think if they cover, they end up getting the upset, but I'm gonna rock with Pitt -11 and over 47.5. The final game on my betting slate for this upcoming week of college football is gonna be Miami at Texas A&M. This will be an incredibly interesting game, especially with Texas A&M coming off their loss against App State. Um, I think A&M will come out and play hungry, but then again, who knows? They may come out and lay an egg. That's why it's kind of intriguing for me. I'm curious in seeing how Texas A&M is going to play. I think Miami's a pretty decent football team. Number 13 might be high in the rankings for them, but I think Miami and Texas A&M are pretty comparable football teams at this point in time. Taking a look at the numbers, we'll see Miami hasn't exactly played anyone. They've had a bit of a cupcake schedule the last 2 weeks of the season, and they're averaging 50 points per game and allowing only 10, with an average of 518 yards of total offense per game. Pretty balanced though. It's almost 280 in the air and 240 on the ground, so they're a pretty balanced football team. And then defensively, they're giving up 228 through the air, but only 58 and a half on the ground. So defensively, their front seven solid. Their secondary is lacking a little bit, but again, they've been up pretty big against these teams, so most of that is probably due to their second and third string defensive starters or defensive players. And then in terms of Texas A&M, they're not a huge offensive juggernaut so far this season, at only 22 and a half points per game. They're allowing just 8.5, so their defense is playing really well against the teams that they have played, including a shutout and only 17 points allowed against App State. Offensively, they've had about 242 passing yards per game and just under 100 rushing yards per game. So I think this game, if Texas A&M is going to have success, and I know I'm a real genius by looking at this, but they're going to need to throw the ball. Miami's rushing defense has been pretty stout, and they've struggled to run the ball. So in order for them to have success, they'll need to throw the ball well. And then their defense is kind of even. Their secondary has been really good at only 112 and a half yards per game, but they've given up about 144 rushing yards per game. So again, if Miami's able to kind of balance their attack and run the ball like they've been, maybe it opens up some areas of the passing game and they can get the passing game going. My pick in this game is going to be Miami plus 6.5. I know they're going on the road to Texas A&M, but Texas A&M's coming off a tough loss. Their confidence is kind of shot. And Miami, I think, is a better team. If you look at the rankings, it'll say, yeah, Miami's a better team. But A&M was ranked in the top 10 last week. I think A&M's rankings more so fit for, high teens, low or high to mid teens type team. And Miami is probably in that same area. I think, but if you're going to give Miami 6.5 with the way they've been playing and Texas A&M's tough loss this week, I'm going to have to pick Miami plus the 6.5. And then, Joe, just to recap my picks for this week. In the first game, I'm going to take BYU plus the points. In the second game, I am going to take Michigan State plus the points. In the third game, Pitt and Western, I'm going to take Pitt minus the 11 and the over. And then in the final game of Miami, Texas A&M, I'm going to take Miami plus the points. So it's a big road dog week for me. I'm taking 3 of the 4 games include road underdogs to cover, but I think they're the better teams. I think we've seen a lot of home favorites over the last couple weeks, and I mean rightfully so. But I think last week we saw that the rankings aren't exactly accurate. It was a pretty crazy week. We saw some upsets that probably shouldn't have happened. And I think this week only continues. I think when the slate for college football looks a little boring and dry is kind of when some craziness happens, and I think that's exactly what this week's looking like. It's not exactly the most exciting slate of college football, but that can always lead to the surprising games and overtime thrillers, surprising upsets. So we'll just have to wait and see this Saturday. But yeah, until then, I'll catch you guys in the next video.